Greetings from the Tintic High Desert. I'm your host, Colby Van Wagoner. This is The Twisted Mind, Fueling Thought, Season 1, Episode 2. This is a serial killer segment. So listener discretion is advised. As you can imagine, we might discuss some subject matter that is for mature audiences, but we're going to keep it a little light, so no need to worry. I won't spook you too much. Like I said, we're broadcasting from the Tintic High Desert Mountains. And I'm Colby Van Wagoner. Tonight's episode, once again, is brought to you by Earth's natural resource, water. So let's get into it. Let's play Who Can Outdo the Other, or not. The serial killer segment. We're going to get into 3 historical serial killers. One's contemporary and has recently come out in the news. Another is H.H. Holmes. And the other is an unknown popular figure, Jack the Ripper. Started off, America is a nature of prosperity, for better or for worse, the most advanced nation of the world. However, it also suffers being one of the most debauched nations, for the fact America has some of the world's most treacherous killers on record, both present and past. Call these individuals evil, disturbed, abhorrent, unnatural, or simply psychologically abhorrent. Serial killers are no figments of anyone's imagination. These are the people who have become killers that are part of modern society. For decades, experts and many of those working in different fields of criminology and government agencies, they seek to uncover what motivates a person to turn into a serial killer, with no definite success. Whatever the case may be, convicted killers and their murderous exploits have captured the attention of the public for over a century. America's most notorious serial killers, many of which you know, have heard about, their exploits have captured and drawn to be books, movies, documentaries, and people have dedicated their lives, both personally and professionally, to capture, study, and reveal the reasons behind the natures of their devious intentions. They've killed men, women, children, infants, and for various reasons, their motives remained unexplained. There's even an estimated 2,100 active American serial killers alone active in the present day. As the list continues to grow, one notorious killer has recently stepped forward with a shocking claim. A claim that has been substantiated through corroboration, testimony, and DNA testing. This convict's name is Samuel Little, age 79, and he's currently incarcerated. The FBI has confirmed an imprisoned murderer is now the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history after he confessed to killing 93 people over a period of 40 years. Law enforcement have matched Samuel Little, age 79, to 50 unsolved cases from 1970 up to 2005 thus far. Officials have now released additional information about 5 cases that span Kentucky, Florida, Louisiana, Nevada, and Arkansas to the public with information in hopes of identifying any unconfirmed victims related to any unsolved cases. The FBI confirmed an imprisoned murderer who confessed to 93 murders, Samuel Little, over 4 decades, is now the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Law enforcement have matched Samuel Little to 50 cases from 1970 to 2005. He's been serving life in prison since 2012 for the murder of 3 women. Samuel Little targeted vulnerable individuals, mostly black women, many of whom were sex workers or drug users. He is a former competitive boxer. Faux pas. Little claimed he would knock his victims out with punches before strangling them, meaning there were not always obvious signs that the person was a victim or had been brutally murdered. Some of these deaths were never investigated by the FBI or law enforcement as a result, and the cases were closed, and many deaths were incorrectly determined to be overdoses or accidental. Some bodies are theorized to never have been found, as law enforcement agents have said. In a statement, the FBI states its analysts believe all of his confessions so far are credible. For many years, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims. Even though he is already in prison, the FBI believes it's important and obviously very essential to seek justice for each victim and to close every possible case. Law enforcement is still working to verify the remaining 43 cases he's confessed to. Officials have claimed Little's memory of the killings have been mostly precise, but he is unable to remember specific dates, which has hindered investigations. It is unclear if Little will face more charges over recent confessions, but obviously the state's prosecuting attorneys will study the cases, the new DNA analysis, and the evidence to bring forth further conviction. Little was arrested in 2012 on drug charges in the state of Kentucky and extradited to California, where officers then carried out DNA testing. Samuel Little had an extensive criminal record with offenses from armed robbery to rape, aggravated assault all across the nation of the United States. DNA results linked him to 3 unsolved murders from 1987 and 1989 in Los Angeles. He pleaded not guilty at the trial, but was eventually convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole. Thank goodness. He was then referred to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, an agency scheme that works to analyze serial offenders of violent and sexual crimes and share information across the local database of law enforcement agencies to cross-reference unsolved crimes. So his DNA from his arrest in 2012 is fed into a criminal database and then his other confessions to stepping forward and claiming he is the suspect in more than 93 other cases of murder, linked his DNA to seven other unsolved cases, and 43 are now underway to be investigated. So that remains to be under investigation by law enforcement. And the segue that brings up our next section is in reference with America's first-term serial killer, H.H. Holmes, who many might be familiar with as America's first-termed serial killer, who was convicted and sentenced to hanging, and also has connections and ties with the unsolved case of Jack the Ripper. Let's get into H.H. Holmes. However, this section will be the focus not of contemporary serial killers, but of a ruthless killer that operated over a century ago. Herman Webster Mudgett, who later changed his name to Howard Henry Holmes, H.H. Holmes, Dr. Holmes. Holmes's murder castle is what he is famous for. His modus operandi, or M.O., any connection to famous Jack the Ripper case, and more recent connections with Samuel Little will be revealed later on in the show. First, let's go to H.H. Holmes. Since most of my research in the past decade influences led to a book I wrote, released in 2012, called H.H. Holmes, The Devil in Me. I do have to admit the research process started off a little shaky, as the imagery, the topics and subject context, and the subject matter was the first of its kind that I had started to enter into as far as serial killers. Before starting this book, H.H. Holmes, The Devil in Me, I finished the research and I published a series called the Crow Mountain series surrounding the Navajo shapeshifter, which is also called the Skinwalker. That was a task in and around itself, more importantly, unknown to me in a way that was preparing me to enter my mind into the world of serial killers and the world of psychology, criminology, and criminal justice systems, simply for the fact that a person enters into this realm and steps through the doorway and starts to see imagery and read and research and absorbs the information into their body and their mind, and it starts to reflect and it starts to bring about the imagery that I was talking about, which then interacts with emotional context, and you start to actually feel and see the imagery. And many people who are authors, writers, artists, or involved in criminology, this transferability or this transference can take a toll on you personally. As I went on to complete a degree, my master's degree in psychology, and now I'm enrolled in a doctoral program of psychology and criminology, it takes it a step further, and I wanted to then continue my work continue research. I love the research process. So a step climbing into the unknown staircase of ascension or descension, whichever way you look at it, into the world of almost certain conflicts, internal and external, the complexities of the subject matter, but definitely an expanse of knowledge, learning, and a whole world of new information came to light. There's two sides of the coin. There's always going to be apprehension on one side and human curiosity on the other. I'm sure most of you can relate with that. If you're listening, you've probably looked at pictures. You've looked into the faces of the pictures of these serial killers and looked into their eyes, and they look back at you, and you look and you can imagine sitting across from them. Now, it's important to understand them from their side looking back at you. You're looking at them with not necessarily, you feel sympathy and empathy for people in the world. And you have feelings and emotions. You wake up in the morning, you have good intentions. On the other side of the reflection is a person that's looking back at you who has killed people. And these serial killers are narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, who are looking back at you not as a person and a human with empathy and sympathy, but as an object. They don't see you as having an internal life, which separates their emotion and feeling, which they are able to represent and pretend to present to have feelings and emotions. Certainly there's a charade and a facade that they can pretend and manipulate the act of sympathy and empathy and love. But looking at other people, they are objects to fulfill a purpose for their own self-gratification. And I would never want to sit in the room with one of these people without them being restrained, definitely, and certainly not to have a conversation about rainbows, unicorns, puppies, and kittens. That's for sure. Let's start with H.H. Holmes at this point, where he imagines his World Fair Hotel, which more commonly became known as H.H. Holmes' house, or what locals would call the castle, and now is notoriously known as the Murder Castle. And hypothetically, if you put yourself inside this murder castle, you might run up a flight of stairs and find that it led to nowhere. You would open up doors and run into solid brick walls. You'd feel comfortable entering a bedroom or a hotel room and see these doorways and feel, oh, it's leading into a bathroom or an adjacent room, a connected room, a place where I can feel like there's another entrance or exit. That's not the case. You'd be inside the room and hear hidden pipes quietly come to life, then smell the gas seeping in through the walls. You'd try to run and realize you were locked inside. Even if the door opened, you probably couldn't find your way out due to the construction of the murder castle. Only H.H. Holmes himself ever knew all of the castle's secrets, including how many people died within its walls. He famously stated at his trial, "I was born with the devil in me. later explaining, "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." It's important to point out that H.H. Holmes was a con man. He was a manipulator. He was very charming. So his motive in life was obviously money, manipulation, and he used his charm in order to manipulate people into signing over insurance claims, signing over deeds, making unknown donations for certain reasons, and he would con them out of their life savings, and they would end up either missing or he would manipulate their deaths into claiming their insurance money, and he would collect on it. He was a con man. In his childhood, H.H. Holmes was born Herman Webster Mudgett. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, May 16, 1861, to Levi and Paige Mudgett. Herman Mudgett was born into a well-to-do family for the time, at least considered somewhat wealthy in 1861, but unfortunately had a troubled childhood, obviously. Holmes' father was an alcoholic and his mother was a devout Methodist who preached Bible scriptures to him on a regular basis. He claims he was bullied as a child, having run in with neighborhood bullies and at school. In the neighborhood, he was forced to be face-to-face with death by some bullies making him face a skeleton, touch it, and feel the texture of the bones of this skeleton inside a medical office. Holmes appeared to be very intelligent at an early age. He showed an interest in pharmaceuticals, medicine, medical dissection, sometimes dissecting and performing abstract and horrific surgery on both live and dead animals, dissections. There had been a rumor going around that Herman Mudgett had been involved in the death of one of his close friends, a relative. It might have been a cousin or a young female relative. It's surrounded around a small kind of marsh swamp area where the pond was relatively not deep. It was somewhat of a secluded area, and the young child was found drowned or suffocated. That is a rumor, and that is something that's been theorized over the centuries, decades, about the investigations and released about H.H. Holmes. Later in his life, Holmes married Clara Lovering in 1978. Within a few years, they had a son and named him Robert Mudgett. In 1880, Holmes attended the Michigan Medical School. In 1884, he graduated. 4 years later, Herman Mudgett became entangled in a scandal at the university. He'd been accused of stealing bodies, mutilating and maiming them, setting them up in certain structures or buildings, and then starting them on fire, burning down the buildings, and collecting the deceased insurance policies. Running scams, collecting the money. This is where he first started to learn how to run his cons. One of history's most infamous serial killers, H.H. Holmes, graduated, left Michigan, and arrived in Chicago in 1886. leaving behind more than one previous life. His wife and his son, Herman Webster Mudgett, and all the previous scandals provided a good reason to change his name. He needed an alias, like in college when he worked in the anatomy lab and mutilated cadavers to defraud life insurance companies. After leaving the university, he spent the next 2 years moving from job to job and running small scams. Or when he was the last person to have been seen with a missing little boy in New York. Or when he worked as a pharmacist in Philadelphia and customers died after taking pills that he had provided. And back then, this is when pharmacists and people who were working in pharmacies mixed their own concoctions. They mixed the powders together and put them in pill forms and capsules. So there's a lot of forming going on in Herman Webster Mudgett's life. And Herman Mudgett skipped town after all these incidents. And for whatever reason, or whatever alias he chose, became Henry Howard Holmes, who soon after his arrival in Chicago achieved a job in a drugstore on 63rd Street and used his knowledge of medicine and his charm and ability to secure this position. Dr. Holmes was fashionable, known for that fedora, his suit, that mustache. He was bright and likable, but also manipulative. That at this point in his life, he was married to 3 women, all of them unknowing of the other's existence. Herman Mudgett married his first wife, Clara Lovering, in 1878 at the age of 19. And 2 years later, they had a son, but he abandoned the two and went to Chicago. Soon after, married Murda Belknap in 1887, even though he had not yet divorced Clara. He filed to divorce Clara Lovering a few weeks after his second marriage, but the papers were never processed in the courts. Finally, he married Georgiana Yoke on January 17, 1894 in Denver, Colorado. Traveling the country, running more scams and schemes and manipulating more people out of money to finance what would be his up-and-coming adventure, the murder castle. Soon after his third marriage, he was arrested for insurance fraud. Holmes was married to 3 women, Clara Lovering, Murda Belknap, and Georgiana Yoke. At this time, in 1887, Chicago was perfectly situated on the shore of Lake Michigan. It was a central hub for an extensive system of railroad networks that were designed to crisscross the nation, all extending from Chicago like a giant web. A decade before, the Great Chicago Fire burned the city of Chicago in October 1871. The fire killed around 300 people, destroyed roughly 3.5 square miles of the city of Chicago, and left more than 100,000 residents homeless. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes began construction on a 3-story building on an empty lot across the street from the drugstore where he worked, which he said would be used for apartments and storefront shops. At that time, it was then planned that the Chicago World's Fair was announced to be coming to town. The 750,000 attendees of the Chicago's World Fair would provide H.H. Holmes with a constant supply of hotel guests and limitless victims, which at this point he sped up his plans and construction for his hotel. The structure was ugly. It was large. The construction plans noted to be containing more than 100 rooms and stretched for an entire city block. At the time, Chicago was a fast-growing city in the late 1880s, and new construction was going up all over the stretch of the American Midwest. Millions of people from all over the world were gathering in Chicago to see the 1893 World's Fair, with the specially constructed White City Recreation Area at its heart. H. Holmes also finished construction on his newly renovated hotel, which locals deemed the Castle, located on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street. The inside of the hotel's design was beyond what anyone could ever imagine. It was elaborate, as if they ever made it out to be. H. Holmes' deviant plans were set in motion, and he was soon working discreetly throughout the hotel and in the basement of his murder castle. For his mansion and murder castle, Holmes planned for the first floor to contain an entire block of storefronts he would be able to rent out to the flood of new businesses opening up and coming into the city. The third floor would contain apartments for the growing population of the city's residents who were looking to make it big in the Windy City, some of whom would become Holmes's later victims. Those victims got to see the second floor, and the especially unlucky ones made it into the basement, which hid the elaborate horrors for which H. Holmes' house and murder castle is now infamous. Holmes switched builders regularly and architects. He fired them on a weekly basis, frequently throughout the building's construction. So no one involved was able to realize the end goal of his game and look at the plans and put all the pieces of the puzzle together and question and realize what was really going on with the plans of the building. The castle was completed in 1892. Holmes would fire the architects, the builders, and the construction workers. He would promise them the payments would be made, but never followed through. Though the mansion didn't look inviting in the least, it's unlikely any of the victims were dragged into its depths willingly. They entered on their own volition and free will, and were likely enchanted by the look of the outside exterior and the entrance of the lobby and the rooms and the decorations, and by the owner's flattery and apparent affluence of the city. However, there was something sinister going on inside the murder castle, and most made it in, but most, unfortunately, never made it out. The second floor of H. Holmes' murder mansion contained hinged walls, false partitions, secret passageways. Some rooms had 5 doors, others had none, or led to false openings with only brick walls behind the doors. This is a psychological ploy, to make patrons feel at home as they first enter their hotel room. You get someone very comfortable. You get them relaxed. Like I said before, they enter the room, and then some of these rooms were particularly designed to lock from the outside, bolted, and Holmes installed secret airless chambers that hid underneath the floorboards. There were also ventilation systems that ran underneath the floors, up the walls, and in through the ceilings, and out through the roof of the hotel murder castle. There were iron-plated lined walls that stifled and served as sound barriers to eliminate noises and refrain any alarm from other hotel guests. Holmes's own apartment had a trapdoor in the bathroom, which opened to reveal a staircase, which led to a windowless cubicle. In the cubicle, there was a large chute that tunneled to the basement. Most likely, this was either used as an escape route to get into the basement, where there was a tunnel leading to an escape exit. All of the doors and some of the steps were connected to intricate alarm systems. Whenever someone stepped into the hall, or headed downstairs, or opened a doorway that was not supposed to be opened, or where someone was not supposed to be at the time, a buzzer sounded in Holmes's bedroom, which would indicate he needed to be somewhere at a certain time and address the situation. One notable room was lined with gas fixtures. Now, here, Holmes would seal his victims inside the room, bolt the door, flip a switch in an adjacent room, and wait. Sometimes he would watch, like a sick and twisted laboratory experimenter. Holmes would slide open a metal plate to view his victims as they suffocated. It's a sufferable, horrible death inside a small hotel room or any small room, to suffocate or be overtaken by fumes of gas. Anyone, it's unimaginable to suffocate. That's a fear of claustrophobia, being underwater and suffocating. That is one. What are your worst fears? Is claustrophobia and suffocation would be at the top of my list. While in other rooms, chutes were nearby in the walls. Ventilation shafts would be switched on and clear out the toxic gas, where Holmes would then enter, open the chutes, and slide his victims where the chutes would lead into the basement. Uncovering Holmes's house of horrors in the murder castle, the first clue about the bizarre floor plan's true purpose came to light when the cops and law enforcement began their investigation and discovered a pile of bones. Most of them were animals, had animal hair, and were mixed in with the rest of human remains. But there were bones so small they belonged to children, no more than 6 or 7 years old. As they descended into the cellar, law enforcement discovered the scope of the murder castle's hidden horrors, and everything became revealed. Down in the basement, beside a blood-covered operating table, they found a woman's blood-soaked clothes. There were surgical surfaces nearby, along with a crematory. 2 of them, side by side. There was an array of medical tools. There was equipment hung on the walls, bizarre torture devices, and shelves of chemicals and disintegrated acids, lime and lime pits. There were vats of acid, 2 or 3 in total, that were directly below the chutes in the walls. Some of law enforcement in the newspapers that were discovered or still in existence, some law enforcement who were inside the basement, it's stated in these newspapers that they fled from the basement from the stench and were unable to return into the basement. Understandably, since nowadays you see crime scene investigators enter in full suits, biohazard suits, and masks with ventilation systems. But these guys, these law enforcement agents in the late 1880s, in the late 1800s, go into a basement where all of this activity had been taking place, and who knows how many people Holmes was responsible for killing and discarding of their bodies. The research is both horrific and overwhelming to know that someone could be responsible for this much planning, this much, analysis of the building of the construction and the planning and following through with it up until the point where we'll get into later when he was captured. Holmes' fascination with dead bodies lasted long past college, from his days of medical school, dissecting bodies and developing surgical skills, which is why people relate him with the Jack the Ripper case as surgical skills. Most likely, theoretically, and there's some people who also connect sketches, ship crew logs that have his handwriting on the passenger manifest. But after dropping his victims through the chutes, he would dissect them, strip them of their flesh, clean the bones, clean the bodies, sell the organs and the skeletons to medical institutions, colleges, schools, or on the black market. And we've all seen, or we remember, when schools or colleges or medical institutions or in the doctor's office, they had that skeleton that looked real. Well, it was real. And I remember looking up skeletons a decade ago and was curious, as most of us are. These skeletons sell for a lot of money. So obviously Holmes had the intention for that need or greed. Once again, his motive being money. Often his victims were hotel employees. During his 2 short years in the murder castle, Holmes had hired more than 150 employees, mostly women, to work as hotel employees, cleaning, stenographers. A few of those were known to be his mistresses as well. Most of them came from wealthy families. Others had no families whatsoever, which would make a lot of sense. When hiring an employee, do you have family? No. That way there's no one to come searching for them. Some of them were never seen or heard from their families again. Holmes sometimes photographed these employees. He took pictures of his favorites. They were young, beautiful. They trusted him because he was a charming gentleman, and they were in a big and unfamiliar city. Holmes began his 2-long-year murder spree at a moment in history where an unprecedented throng of unknowns and unaccompanied strangers were flooding the streets of Chicago, and they were looking for temporary housing. People come and go all the time in big cities, often without notice, so the disappearance of young men and women, or women working under Holmes, could always be excused by Holmes as they moved on, or they headed back home, or they quit without notice. And these people were never seen or heard from again. They were missing, most likely becoming H.H. Holmes' victims. Chicago is a city on the rise. It's centrally located, and thanks to the National Railway hub, there was a fresh flow of people coming in and out of Holmes' murder mansion. Also in the city of Chicago, the World's Fair is just starting. Despite all the well-connected women who went missing under his employment, suspicions of murder were not what eventually led to Holmes' demise, his capture, and his sentencing and death. Rather, theft and financial schemes gone wrong caused his arrest in Boston on November 17, 1894, after decades of criminal activity, the scale and complexity of which you really need to, a book to read to fully grasp. H. Holmes was behind bars and finally caught. While in jail, connections between him and at least one murder were revealed in a pile of financial charges obscured by the more sinister accusations. 1894, as I stated before, law enforcement and police were at that point where they were exploring the murder castle's winding passages. They were in the rooms, they were on the third, second, and first floor, and then in the basement of the murder castle, exploring its winding passages, the office, the apartments, the rooms, while Holmes sat behind bars and could do nothing. At first, they were confused and astounded at what they found. Though he boasted of committing at least 27 murders, as a con man and someone you can never trust or believe because of his manipulative mind, he gave 3 different confessions while he was imprisoned and waiting to go to trial, all of which contradicted every statement in 3 of the confessions he made. All of the numbers were contradictory. The 27 murders turned to 200, then back down to 3 to 5. The true amount of victims was impossible to corroborate because the mansion was specifically equipped for Dr. Holmes to disintegrate the leftover body parts, burn in the crematory his victims, and the acid vats dispose of the bodies, or like I said, burn them in 2 human-sized stoves. In one pile of the ashes, investigators found jewelry, small gold chains, rings, and women's clothing to shoes, women's shoes. The 1893 World's Fair was one of America's history's most attended cultural events, and a million people attended over the duration of the fair, noting the thousands of people who went missing during the World's Fair. Some papers suggested the actual count of Holmes's victims stretched more into the range of 200 victims. At Holmes's trial, for the most part, he represented himself at the trial, displaying his classic grace and somehow a remarkable familiarity with the law, according to one of the papers at the time. His charm wasn't enough for the jurors, though, and he was unanimously sentenced to death by hanging. Holmes feared for what would happen to his body after after he was hung and placed in a grave and left unattended for those out to make an easy buck. He understood, just like he was doing, that grave robbery would be something that when he reached the public papers and there was a public outcry, that people would go search out his grave, and grave robbery was still a very common happening. And Holmes, being very familiar with that, he understood what could be done with his body after his death. And when he was buried, he requested at his trial he be encased in cement within his coffin. At that point, it's theorized, it's said that Holmes was offered money by a newspaper for a statement for his story, which he accepted. And during the trial and waiting for sentencing, and as the trial began, he penned in his own words and sold his story to the newspaper, basically a conman's autobiography, dispelling his own life's misfortunes, spreading false truths, and some would claim intended to fake his own death. Theories claim Holmes paid someone, a guard, someone familiar, a visitor, to take his place in the jail cell and then head to the gallows and be hung from the noose. Others theorized a guard took his place while on the gallows and he was hung in Holmes' place. Holmes would then dress as a guard and walk out of the prison and be a free man. Holmes' execution. Before his death in 1896, H. Holmes suggested he was turning into the devil. He suggested even his face, he said, was taking on a demonic look. Which we return that, even in the mind of H. Holmes and psychology, if you could look into H. Holmes' MRI scan and EEG, it would probably be concluded that there was something wrong inside his brain that was going on and would reveal some sort of neurological damage or something to cause him, nature or nurture, or physiological damage to the neurology of his brain to cause him to go into such extensive planning and scheming and to be able to pull off what he said. But now he is hallucinating, and now he is seeing himself as the devil or turning into the devil. And in the trial, as it was stated, Holmes's own words, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer. No more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." In Holmes's words, and reading through all of what he penned, there is definitely something wrong with this person's brain, and I don't think that many people out there would argue the fact that he was definitely one of America's most notorious, infamous serial killers, which we now compare, and which I brought up earlier, which relates to why I discussed the relation with Samuel Little, claiming to have 93 victims, when H. Holmes would be convicted of 3 to 5 victims, not 27, because some of those people he claimed to have killed ended up showing up later as surviving, which he was just taking advantage, it seems, for the sensationalism of the newspapers to sell his story and therefore get more money. So his motive is basically money mixed with murder. Now I want to get into the exhumation of H. Holmes's grave. I want to keep it kind of short because I think we might be going over a little longer on the time. And I want to make sure that we're keeping this short because I want to get into the Jack the Ripper case. And I also want to keep this within an hour. And we are at 55 minutes, which is very unexpected for me. But as I said, this is my second broadcast of the Twisted Mind and Fueling Thought. And this is the serial killers segment. Now for me, and I don't know many of you out there who are interested in serial killers or follow the variations or motives of serial killers and the most infamous serial killers out there, who are your most intimidating serial killers to look at? You can go to the Twisted Mind Facebook page. Underneath this broadcast, let's discuss who is the most intimidating, horrifying serial killer for you to look at, and who scares you to look at the most. For me, I've always been intimidated by Richard Ramirez. That guy's face is extended, his hair, his jaw is extended. He has that look in his eyes. And like I said, look into H.H. Holmes's eyes. The eyes are the window of the soul, it said. And there just seems to be that glaze of vacant nothingness behind, no feeling whatsoever for remorse of what they've done. Jeffrey Dahmer is another one. You look at that man. Ted Bundy, in his own right, is creepy because he also looks like a charmer. And what he did, we'll get into in another episode of serial killers. But what he did is deplorable and abhorrent because he didn't use poison gas. He didn't strike out of impulse. He would stalk, and he was driven by a sexual desire, a hatred of women. That's another case in itself, but the scary thing about Ted Bundy is that he looks very charming and like a gentleman, and drove around and invited people into his car. He had a girlfriend, and that facade in itself is very scary. But like I said, Richard Ramirez, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy is my third that would scare me. But go ahead and get on the Twisted Mind Facebook page or during the broadcast and let me know who are your most intimidating and horrific serial killers of all time. And right now we're going to get into the curse of H.H. Holmes. And the Jack the Ripper correlations and connections. Jack the Ripper, it's announced that they recently had DNA tests performed on a shawl or a scarf, and Jack the Ripper may have been a Polish barber named Aaron Kamiński. Scientists claim after fresh DNA tests were performed that Jack the Ripper, previously, we all know that Jack the Ripper infamously murdered at least 5 women in the Whitechapel district area in 1888 and was never caught. There's been many claims, many suspects, but the fresh DNA from this shawl and a suspect, Aaron Kamiński, were performed, and it somehow came up with the Polish barber, and Scotland Yard or researchers from Liverpool, John Moores University, say they've carried out the most advanced study to date regarding this case using only remaining physical evidence linked to the murders. DNA found on a shawl next to the mutilated body of one of the serial killer's victims they claim has proved to match to the barber, Aaron Kamiński. The shawl the scientists analyzed was found next to the killer's 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes, and is speckled with what is claimed to be blood and semen of the killer. The young man had lived with his 2 brothers, Aaron Kamiński and his 2 brothers, lived with a sister in Greenfield Street, only 200 yards away from where his 3rd victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found dead. or it is theorized and claimed that Aaron Kosminski DNA was found on the shawl or the scarf or the piece of clothing, and the DNA was somehow linked to Aaron Kosminski. I'll personally point out that with the chain of evidence, 121 years have gone by. How many hands has this piece of evidence gone through? How many people have touched this scarf or this shawl or piece of clothing? So the chain of evidence, pretty much, if you took it to a prosecuting attorney, if you entered it in as Exhibit A, the scarf that was found at the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes, the chain of evidence is going to easily be argued that too many people have handled it at this point for it to be entered in as evidence. And it just goes on, but let's just close the case. No one is going to be able to prove who Jack the Ripper is, in my opinion. What do you think? Is H.H. Holmes linked with Jack the Ripper? Will the Jack the Ripper case ever be solved? And is this new DNA evidence, is it reliable in any means, way, shape, or form? And how would it be reliable if you were to point out as evidence being entered in as evidence-based court exhibit evidence? So as any criminal profile would put together the where, when, who, why, and comes up with possible witnesses, evidence, and other hard facts to place a person at the crime scene, the scarf and new evidence is not much more than what we knew before now. First, as a profiler and putting together a profile, as Dr. H.H. Holmes being a predator, he's going to have hunting territory, just like an animal. He's going to be looking for prey and victims. He's going to choose a kill zone, which was Chicago, his murder castle. He chose to kill indoors, out of the view of others, discreetly. Indirectly, he used gas. He placed them in chambers and was not directly involved in killing his victims, other than dismembering them in the basement to get rid of their bodies. While the Ripper murders were performed out in the open, their bodies, the victims' bodies, were left on display in the streets or in places that were potentially an area to be caught, placing the Ripper, Jack the Ripper, in an open area, leaving him more suspect to be caught or viewed by people out in the open, whereas H.H. Holmes was inside, out of view, and these two criminal profiles are completely different and contrasting in comparison with one another. So for me, to put together a profile, H.H. Holmes was discreet, had a place to take his victims, was not directly involved until after their bodies were put down into the basement. Now, in contrast, Jack the Ripper, he was out in the open. He had no motive for financial gain, whereas H.H. Holmes killed for insurance claims, money, selling the skeletons on the black market, making money. Jack the Ripper killed out of impulse. He wanted to kill prostitutes, and his grounds were the Whitechapel streets, and he left his victims out in the open. So the profiles, to me, are contrasting. So I don't see any relation with Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes. What are your thoughts on this in terms of M.O., hunting ground, criminal profiling, H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper, in my determination, a complete contrast from one another. And I want you to post your thoughts on the Twisted Mind Facebook page. And you can also head over to H.H. Holmes, The Devil in Me, and post your thoughts on that Facebook page. That's where H.H. Holmes, The Devil in Me, the book, is available. It's also available on Amazon. And I want to point out that H.H. Holmes' The Devil in Me was a very tough and difficult book to research, write, and get through. And it is also written not as a historical nonfiction book. It is written with historical fiction, but it's done so with the view from how it would be to experience the view from the killer and the victims and what was going on at the time. It gives you a point of view from the story that took place from his childhood up until he was hung. So the book is not for everybody. It contains mature content. And like I said, it's a different approach to writing the story about H.H. Holmes. And it was written and released and published in 2012. And it's available on Amazon.com, H.H. Holmes, The Devil in Me by Colby Van Wagoner. And I appreciate everybody who's purchased it at this point. I never thought I'd sell a book in my life. It's been a decade. It's been over a decade since I've been an author. So I want to get into what's going on currently with the film adaptation, headed by Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese. The Devil in White City, a book by Eric Larson, Murder, Magic, and the Madness at the Fair That Changed America, was first published in February 2003. First, there's the story within the book of Daniel Hudson Burnham, who was the chief architect of the Chicago's World Fair in White City. Then there's the story of H.H. Holmes, a murderer running rampant at that time, 1893, often considered, and is termed America's first serial killer, because he was the first serial killer who killed more than 3 people in different locations, because the murder castle was not the only place he murdered a victim. There was the place in Philadelphia. There was when he killed the Pietzel in another area, and the 2 people who owned the pharmacy he murdered in their homes. So he's not a mass murderer. He's a serial killer because he killed in separate times and different places. And he was caught and convicted, and therefore is termed as America's first serial killer. It's semantics. Now, the movie adaptation, the history of that is that the book was written in 2003. Tom Cruise purchased the book rights to Eric Larson's The Devil in White City. Under Cruise Wagner Productions, Cruise's film production company developed the screenplay based on Eric Larson's bestseller, The Devil in White City, about a real-life serial killer, H.H. Holmes, at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition Fair. Catherine Bigelow was also attached to the project to produce and direct. Cruise had abandoned the project after 7 years. Sorry, I have to count backwards. I have some brain damage, as I stated in my last episode. So after 6 years, sometime in late 2009, Tom Cruise abandoned the project, in my opinion, thankfully. And luckily, Leonardo DiCaprio purchased the film rights through his production company, Appian Way, in November 2010. And producer and director Martin Scorsese joined with Leonardo DiCaprio in 2015. DiCaprio is stated to be starring in it. Scorsese will be producing and directing, and both of them will be executive producers in the adaptation of the film. Very exciting. August 2015, Paramount TV won the rights to the DiCaprio-Scorsese project in a competitive question bidding. From Paramount, Rick Yorn, Emma Koskoff, Jennifer Davison, and Stacey Scher are also going to be producing and involved with the project. And February 2019, Hulu announced their partnership with the project as well and plans to stream it on their online service. Too bad for you, Netflix. You passed up the next really big release. I love Netflix, don't get me wrong, but you know, if H.H. Holmes and the White City, the Devil in White City, is going to be brought to Hulu, I'm certainly not going to miss it. What about you? The writer of the screenplay for Appian Way and the Scorsese DiCaprio joint venture is obsessed with the Devil in White City novel, and for over a decade, a Midwesterner. In a strange and twisted way, attributes the history of the period. And the screenplay writer has been in the works. I believe it's about finished. That's about all that can be said about the current project underway by DiCaprio Scorsese at this time. So what do you think about The Twisted Mind, Fueling Thought, Season 1, Episode 2, Serial Killers and the Serial Killers segment? Let's play who can outdo the other, or not, preferably. There's enough of that in the world. That light and love to everybody who's been listening. And out of everything that you can do is you can go to the subscribe button on YouTube. You can continue to spread the word. This is my second production broadcast. I appreciate you. Like I said, my sponsor is nature's natural resource, water. Broadcasting from the Tintic High Desert, where it's been a rainy afternoon. My birthday episode. Happy birthday to me. And I want to thank everybody for supporting me over the decade. And I want to thank all my friends, everybody out there listening. I know this is a very scary and dark topic to discuss. However, there are things that I think we need to realize that are a part of us in this world that do come forth and are out there that we have to accept and realize that this is just part of human nature. It comes out and it's part of our history. It's part of our life. And I want to leave you with the statement before we leave and sign off for the night. The Twisted Mind, Fueling Thought, Season 1, Episode 2, the Serial Killer segment, H.H. Holmes, Jack the Ripper, and the contemporary serial killer who claims to have killed 93 people, Samuel Little, age 79. What are your thoughts about those three serial killers and serial killers that intimidate and horrify you overall? Leave your thoughts on the Facebook page and let's get into a discussion during the listening party. I look forward to your thoughts. I look forward to your suggestions on future shows. Like I said, coming up, I'm going to be discussing more about the Skinwalkers and my Crow Mountain series. And I'm going to be doing probably ghost towns, Utah's abandoned ghost towns and mines and areas where there are places of interest for Utah's historic societies. Because that kind of fascinates me in Utah's history and kind of brings out spookiness. So those are future episodes, but the next one will most likely definitely be Skinwalkers. And the second one after that would be Utah's abandoned cities, mining towns, ghost towns, and mines. But I want to leave you with the quote. In my head, the most settling part of not only H.H. Holmes but serial killers in general isn't what they did and what he did, but in what ways we notice bits that exist inside us and don't make us feel very good. I'm your host, Colby Van Wagoner. This is the Twisted Mind Fueling Thought from the Tintic High Desert. Have a good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in.